The 1981 film Cutter's Way is one of the best thrillers I've ever seen, and one of my favorite movies. Unfortunately, hardly anyone has ever seen or heard of it. Cutter's Way was directed by Yvonne Passer and stars an electric duo comprised of Jeff Bridges and John Hurd. For anyone considering watching this film, an early Jeff Bridges performance is likely the main draw, but while he does excel in his role, in my opinion, he's outshined by the brilliant John Hurd in a career-best role. Hurd was a very underrated actor, who unfortunately is more recognizable for his turns as the dad in Home Alone and the piss-drunk corrupt cop in the first season of The Sopranos than for his outstanding work in Cutter's Way. The tremendous and tragic performance he gives is one reason to watch this relatively obscure 80s movie. Another reason is that it stands out from the pack of vapid Hollywood Mick movies that leave you feeling hollow the moment the credits begin to roll. Cutter's Way is not just another form of escapism. Although the story, in essence, is a murder mystery, the story feels like much more than the sum of its parts. The stakes are higher, and in a strange way reach far beyond the cheapened movie binary of life and death. Those stakes aren't limited to, is the bad guy really the killer, and will he get away with it? But rather, we ask ourselves at the end, is there such thing as justice, and is there hope for a better tomorrow? There is a symbolic significance and an urgency to the story and its climax that emanates dire importance. The awesome power of storytelling is utilized here to its full potential, and results in a film that borders on the mythological. The bottom line is that Cutter's Way is a movie that's going to force your brain cells out of slumber. It demands your full attention, and if you give into it, you'll be rewarded with a rich, meaningful story that you won't soon forget. If you're on the prowl for some easy entertainment on the eyeballs, steer clear of Cutter's Way. If, however, you find yourself in the market for an impactful story, Cutter's Way is right up your alley. And if you haven't yet seen it, I recommend you pause this video here and return after you've watched it, as you are now cruising on the highway to the spoiler zone. Cutter's Way is adapted from a novel, and its literary origins influence the storytelling in the film. The plot churns slowly, and Passer takes his sweet time planting seeds in the first act. Jeff Bridges is the hedonistic, rakish, and aptly named Rich Bone. John Hurd is the witty, disillusioned, crippled, and alcoholic war veteran Alex Cutter. At first glance, the two friends have many differences, but they share two things in common: an affection for Alex's wife, Mo, and a lack of purpose in life. Where the previous generation would have placed their chips on religion or a career, Bone and Cutter fill their voids by sleeping with married women and drinking, respectively. In many ways, they reflect the post-war pessimism that accompanied America's awakening to the incestuous corruption of their political and corporate establishment. I saw the war on TV just like everyone else. Cutter scowls at Bone at the midpoint of the film. At the sight of the atrocities, Cutter cites the three reactions shared by everyone. In his own words,
"The first one was real easy. I hate the United States of America. Yeah. You see the same damn thing the next day and you move up a notch. There is no God. Yeah. But you know what you finally say? What everybody finally says? I'm hungry. I'm hungry, Rich."
Cutter's cynical insights point a spotlight at a darkened patch of human nature. Compassion and empathy have its limits. Humanity, left to its undivine devices, will devour itself to temporarily alleviate its hunger. Rarer and rarer are you able to find the person willing to sacrifice their life or their daily bread for a cause or principle greater than themselves. Everyone is driven by hunger, but there are two kinds of hunger: physical, corporeal hunger, and spiritual, transcendent hunger. The difference between the two is the difference between being a coward and being a hero. And as Cutter says, the world is short of heroes. The world is short of people daring enough to reject the contagion of selfish excess and remedy the injustices plaguing our paradise lost. The film's inciting incident gives our protagonists an opportunity to discover a purpose, to lay a claim to heroism. After a midnight tryst with a wealthy and married woman, Bone cruises down an alley in his rickety car. The engine sputters and finally gives out. Another car rolls up behind him. The passenger gets out to stash something in a trash can and nearly runs Bone over. It isn't until the next day that we find out what the man threw out into the trash: the body of 17-year-old Vicky Duran. Having left his dead car at the scene of the crime, Bone becomes the prime suspect. Bone is grilled by the police. He can't identify the face of the man responsible, but when he sees him riding a horse in a parade the next day, he calls him out immediately. Bone's confidence in his ID on the perpetrator diminishes when Cutter points out who exactly he is. The man in question is J.J. Cord, the uber-wealthy oil tycoon whose face graces the cover of Time magazine and whose power and reach gives him the status of a god amongst men. The kind of status that affords you the luxury of getting away with murder. Bone is reluctant to tango with such a formidable foe. Cutter, on the other hand, is invigorated by the prospect of busting Cord and pours all of his manic energy into doing so. This split between the two friends highlights the key difference between them, which is that they're both driven by opposite hungers. Bone seeks to satiate the longings of the body, and Cutter the longings of the soul. In avoiding Cord, Bone seeks to bone another day. But Cutter's way consists of achieving the heroism he didn't find in the jungles of Vietnam through exacting justice for Vicky's murder. Bone is selfish, but he doesn't much attempt to conceal that fact. Cutter's motivations are more complicated. It may seem that his actions are driven by an altruistic conviction to do what is right for its own sake, but it's clear from the way he talks to Vicky's sister Val and objectifies her that he doesn't much care for her. Cutter is hungry for revenge. Like many Americans, he was sold out by the fat cats and bureaucrats that sent him and many others to war in Vietnam. They used him as a pawn that sent young men to their death for dubious reasons. For the string pullers behind the scenes, their bacon was never put on the line. Many lost everything. Cutter lost his left eye, arm, and leg. He also lost his ambitions, his hope, the cherished illusions that separated him from the bottle. They say that heroes are made in war. They're cast in the ironclad bravery necessary to willingly stare down the barrel of death for a just cause. In an unjust war, there is a shortage of heroes. The only hunger driving such a war is the hunger for extra zeros. In the hunt for Cord, Cutter concentrates all of his anger and resentment and projects it onto Cord, whose wanton disregard for innocence and human life reflects his conception of the people responsible for his miserable life and lost potential. Call it justice, call it revenge. Cutter now has a purpose, a way to satiate his spiritual hunger and a path to heroism. Bone has no way of conceptualizing Cutter's way because he had never been in war. He's never known anything other than his playboy lifestyle, so when he crosses paths with a grave injustice, he's more than willing to sweep it under the rug in order to continue existing, to continue satisfying his hunger for pleasure. He has no greater motivations than that. Even when Bone finally agrees to play a role in Cutter's scheme to nail Cord, it comes when he's faced with the prospect of having to end his drifting ways and anchor himself to his job and accept more responsibility. Bone spends the rest of the film deflecting responsibility of any kind. He lies about delivering the blackmail letter to Cord. He treats the whole operation as if it were some kind of joke. After he sleeps with Mo, he leaves her in the middle of the night despite telling her he loved her and her opening up about her depression. When the house burns down with Mo in it, Cutter assumes that Cord is responsible, and while, through some excellent direction, the truth of the matter remains forever ambiguous, Bone is very quick to deem it a suicide. That's the truth he clings to, and he's even willing to assume the guilt associated with it to avoid the potential of Cord being responsible, to avoid the ultimate confrontation. Mo is one of the tragic casualties of Cutter's way. She stuck with Cutter through the thinnest of times, sustaining herself on a thimble of hope that one day he might change. Her character represents another dimension of the misery brought back home from war, those subjected to the residual effects of the trauma suffered in war. For Cutter, whether Mo was killed or committed suicide is irrelevant. Either way, Cord is responsible. Mo's death is the final straw for Cutter. Imprisonment will no longer suffice. Cutter wants an eye for his eye. The opportunity arises when Cord throws a lavish party at his grand estate. Bone and Cutter sneak into the party, and in a final moment of indecision, Bone pleads with Cutter. "What's it going to prove?" he asks. "It's not going to change anything. It's not going to make you whole again. Nothing is ever going to do that." Bone's comments here encapsulate his character. He isn't ignorant to the injustices of the world, but he chooses to emotionally detach himself from them. He rationalizes his passivity by emphasizing the insignificance of his actions. In his mind, one man, or even two, are unable to effect change to a system that is rotten to its core. The irony is that it's his very passivity and escapist attitude that tolerates corruption and injustice and allows it to continue in perpetuity. It takes the example of someone who fits the definition of a hero to inspire others to mend a broken system. Even in the face of futility and almost certain death, Cutter hunts down his white whale. When asked by Bone if he's going to kill Cord, Cutter replies, "It's what I do." In his view, it's the line of work he was foisted into by people like Cord. It's that sense of karmic justice that Cutter is starved for, and it takes us into a climax that is excellently crafted and almost surreal. One of the more interesting symbols we see recurring in the climax is that of the white horse. Traditionally, the white horse symbolizes purity, goodness, and righteousness. It was the steed deemed most worthy for heroes. Passer, however, distorts the traditional usage of the symbol. We see a white horse prominently at the end of the first act when Bone spots Cord riding one, dressed in black. In my view, and in keeping with the thematic bones of the story, this is meant to highlight the morally gray nature of the era. There is no objective sense of good and evil. Public benefactors deemed as pillars of the community are externally good yet internally evil. Interestingly, Cutter is also dressed in black and white when he rides the white horse into Cord's study. The degree of ambiguity Passer creates is unnerving. Right up until the final seconds of the film, we don't really know if Cutter is avenging the murder of a teenage girl or attempting to assassinate an innocent man. Cutter doesn't accomplish his goal, per se, and dies in its pursuit. It's up to Bone to pick up the pieces of his mission. It's time for him to finally make a decision. And he does. After the film released, director Yvonne Passer said, quote, "You can assassinate movies as you can assassinate people. I think United Artists murdered the film, or at least they tried to murder it." Cutter's Way was unfortunately hamstrung by studio politics, and I think that plays a big role in why the film has flown under the radar for so many decades. When the film was completed, the studio heads calling the shots deemed it unworthy of commercial success. Passer didn't see the film with a paying audience until several weeks later at the Houston Film Festival. At that festival, the film won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Best Actor for John Hurd. Undoubtedly, part of the reason why the studio canned the film is its arthouse sensibility. Ironically, it's for that very reason that the film has begun to find its audience finally. In the title, I refer to it as a thriller, but that term only applies very loosely. The film is far more nuanced to be boxed in by genre. Cutter's Way has been compared to other 70s noirish films like The Long Goodbye and Chinatown. I love both of these films, but what stands out to me about Cutter's Way is the sense of timelessness captured in its themes and in its characters. Cutter's Way has picked up some traction in recent years and developed a bit of a cult following. It's my hope that the direction from Passer and the brilliant performances from Bridges, Hurd, and Lisa Eichhorn get the recognition that they deserve, and that the cult following of Cutter's Way continues to grow in the years to come.